So, can you take me back from the beginning? What drew you to bootmaking?
I can't say I was ever attracted to bootmaking in the beginning. My mother began teaching me to sew when I was 12 years old. I was raised in a conservative little church where the ladies all wore long hair and long dresses. I started sewing clothing at 12. By 15, I was sewing clothing professionally. By 16, I had my own business sewing for women in the not only my congregation but the community. And I didn't have dreams of becoming a shoemaker because I didn't know that people could make shoes. But when my husband and I married, we moved from Missouri, where we're both from, to Guthrie, Oklahoma, where we live now. And after 6 months of no sewing business, I just got bored. And I answered an ad in the paper for stitching boot tops. I had no idea what that meant. I'd never worn cowboy boots. And it took me a couple weeks to figure out what was going on in there. But when I did, I realized this is who I am. This is what I want to do. It was wonderful because, again, it wasn't like discovering, oh, I think I want to do this. It was like discovering who I'd always been all along, and I just hadn't realized it. My first teacher in that first boot shop was a man named Jay Griffith. He was a legend and a character. He had businesses and worked for other businesses all across Texas, and he ended up, at the end of his life, he ended up in Guthrie, and that's where I intersected with him, right at the very end of his career. And Jay was a fantastic bootmaker, a wonderful designer. I have people say to me, oh, you're good with color and design because you're a woman. And I tell them everything I know about color and design I learned from a grumpy old alcoholic. So when I was working for Jay, I decided, hey, we're making cowboy boots. I want a pair of cowboy boots. And Jay allowed me to make a pair of boot tops and send them to the back to be finished. And those were just obnoxious. They had flowers and little hearts and butterflies, and they were pink. And I still have them, but they're definitely not my taste today. When you work in a boot shop, when you get a job in a boot shop, you're trained to do your job, and that's what you do. You don't get paid to learn bootmaking. I worked for Jay for a year and a half as an employee stitching boot tops. He taught me to stitch boot tops, and then I did that for money. Then later, I spent a year and a half with Ray Dorwart, one of Jay's students, and I paid Ray to teach me to build cowboy boots. When I paid Ray to train me, I made myself a pair of boots, and that was my very first pair of boots I'd ever built all the way from start to finish. They didn't fit me real well, but it was exciting to know that I had made a pair of boots. And then there was the first pair of boots that I made for a client who ended up being the husband of my first grade teacher, because when I was a child, I lived here in Guthrie and reconnected with my first grade teacher, and her husband ordered a pair of boots just to be nice. I don't think they fit really well either. When I look at the work of other makers, I always try to learn something. What are they doing well that I'm not doing well? And occasionally I see things that they're not doing well that I realize, hey, I'm doing okay in this particular part. And then I'm always just looking at little design details, ways to shape a flower, different colors to put together that maybe I hadn't thought of. There's always something to learn. I've been doing research for a book, and what I'm learning is that cowboy boots have always straddled that line between art and craft. They always have, because when cowboys started riding the trail north, driving the cattle, they had perfectly functional riding boots. And there was absolutely no reason for their riding boots to sprout flowers and butterflies. The only reason for that was fun and entertainment and vanity. And that's the reason I'm obsessed with cowboy boots, because you have these boot tops with this explosion of art and color. And then you have the foot, which is gear. The foot has to be functional and solid. And then you have to merge those two things. My goal is always to make a pair of boots that you could ride in and you could wear in the cow lot, but you don't want to because it's too pretty. I got my job with Jay in 1990, and then I opened my own boot shop in 95. I run a business called Sorrell Notions and Findings, which, looking back on it, I would have named it something much shorter, but I'm a word nerd, and notions means sewing supplies like thread, and findings means shoemaking supplies like steel shanks and shank covers and that sort of thing. So I named it Sorrell Notions and Findings. And what I do is just try to bring in everything that a boot or shoemaker might need to make boots and shoes, because these materials and supplies are so incredibly hard to find. I remember when I got into this business, people would say to me, we used to have a tool that did this thing, or we used to have this sort of supply and it was great, but now we can't get it anymore. And what I learned when I began visiting shoemaking conferences in Europe and meeting European shoemakers, I learned that sometimes these things really were available. It's just no one was bringing them into the US. I started my business with a idea for providing tools for custom cowboy boot makers. And then I realized that everyone in this industry needs tools and supplies, and beginners need books. It's great to have videos, but books are wonderful because you can lay them out and you can refer back to them. And so I'm very interested in selling books. I sell supplies for shoes. These are counters for shoes. I sell bootmaking supplies. These are lasts. So every boot or shoe is built around a form called a last, and the last is what determines what sort of shoe you're making. You can't make a man's hiking boot on a lady's high-heeled last, and you can't make a cowboy boot on a athletic shoe last. So you have to have a last for every type of shoe or boot you're building, and the lasts come in different sizes, which is the number, like 8, 9, or 10, and different widths, which is the letter, like A, B, C, or D. And I keep, I don't know, maybe 2,000 of these in stock all the time. I sell at least one pair of lasts every single day. And many days I sell 5 or 20. I just never know. But the lasts are incredibly popular because they're difficult to get in the US. We used to have a last company in the US. They finally shut it down and moved to China. And now all the lasts have to be imported. And of course, it's expensive to import. You have to deal with currency conversion. So basically what I'm doing is providing a service where I keep them in stock, and then you can buy them from me in US dollars and pay US freight. These are turned. So they have a CAD program that has the dimensions of the last, and then they're turned, and they start from a big block, and it's basically just scraped away and carved away until they reach the dimensions that the computer tells it needs to be. There's a factory in England that does make lasts, and they can carve by hand out of wood, but these are, I haven't been to the factory, but this starts with a giant block of plastic, and I believe they put it in some sort of machine that just carves away everything that's not the last. I have so many tools and supplies that aren't going to make sense to the average person. This is just thread for stitching soles, and it used to only be available in black and white, but now you can have turquoise stitch soles if you want. These are the little pieces that make the toe of your boots hard. These are soles. I am the US rep for a small tannery in England called Baker Leather. They do pit tanning, which means their leather is put in giant pits full of oak bark and left for 6 months or so until it's thoroughly tanned. It makes wonderful leather. This is my personal collection of kangaroo. I've been collecting kangaroo for years. The interesting thing about creating art with leather is that, unlike an artist where if I need a certain shade of purple, I can just mix it, with leather I have to work with the leather that I have. And so I have always collected, if I had money, I was spending it on kangaroo, because even though I don't need that color today, who knows, 10 years I might need it. And I have a huge collection of many colors of leather. And then I also I import kangaroo leather from Italy, and I can do custom colors. So now I import it in whatever colors I want. The foot is typically or often not kangaroo. I like to use ostrich or alligator for the foot, but the tops, for what I do, the tops are always kangaroo, because if you're going to do intricate inlay and overlay, there is absolutely nothing better than kangaroo. It's thin, but it's also strong. And so when you're doing inlay and overlay, you're putting layers together. And if you use a heavier leather, it gets hard and stiff. So this is my boot shop. 2 of my ballasts went out last week, so it's a little dark right now. I will fix that soon, I promise. I began playing with shoes. Olsen Stelzer in the 1940s made cowboy boot shoes. It was a way to use less leather when leather was scarce during wartime. And I've always been obsessed with them, so I brought that back and started playing with it. Olsen Stelzer did this part in carved leather, but I do it with inlay and overlay. This is a teeny tiny little pair of shoes for a lady with small feet. This boot, this is a reproduction of a pair of boots that Hank Williams ordered from Dixon Boot Company. And I saw a photo of Hank Williams wearing these boots, and I tracked them for several years trying to find out who had made those boots. I was obsessed with this wingtip. This is the most unique wingtip I've ever seen in my whole entire career, and I wanted to know who made it. And I finally figured out that it was Dixon Boot Company in Wichita Falls, Texas. And then after I found out who had made them, I was able to get better pictures of the boots, and I actually found pictures of a customer at Dixon holding this pair of boots, this design. And I got pictures from the Hank Williams Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, and I'm making a reproduction of Hank Williams boots. So this is my curve needle. She is the boss of the shop. You notice I always fondle her and treat her gently and tell her how wonderful she is. Otherwise, she will make my life miserable, which she did a couple of days ago. Evidently, she wasn't in a good mood.
What happened?
Oh, she just decided to eat my boots. This machine stitches the soles. So in Europe, the shoemakers are stitching soles by hand. But in the United States, this machine was developed to stitch soles, and it was developed around the time that cowboy boots were invented. So cowboy boots and this machine came into being together. It is traditional to stitch cowboy boots on a machine like this.
And how old is that machine?
This machine is from the 1940s. What's really difficult about this machine is you put the boot in upside down. So the whole boot is here. I can only see the top of the sole. So I'm stitching blind. I can't see where I'm going. And then there's a little blade here that cuts a channel because you want the stitches to fall down into that channel, and then you can close the channel over it and you're not walking directly on your stitches. But if you tilt or in any way don't do it right, your stitches will come out of your channel. And if you're not paying attention, you will go wide on the toe or something. Anyway, or she'll just decide that the tension is wrong today when it was perfect yesterday.
She sounds fickle.
She is very fickle. We love her anyway.
And then could you tell me what these are for?
These are crimp boards. The foot of a cowboy boot is called the vamp. And the foot part of a cowboy boot, you can see how with a cowboy boot, it's basically a four-piece construction. You have a front panel, a back panel, a heel, and all three of those pieces are just flat and they make a little curve. But the foot part has to become this completely three-dimensional shape. And one of the ways that you can achieve that before you even get to putting it on the last is stretching it over a board like that, and that is called crimping. And this is a crimp break. So the crimp break, you can, let's move those over. You can take your wet leather and put it on this board and drop this down, and that forces it into that three-dimensional shape. And you let it sit there for a while, depending on the leather, and then you can take it out and put it on the boards. I use this machine to stitch the side seams of my cowboy boots. That's all I use it for, but this is a nice heavy machine. You could use it for, I don't know, harness work or gun holsters or whatever, but I use it for side seams. And then these are not my personal machines. These are machines I use for students, but I also have a flatbed sewing machine for stitching boot tops, doing the decorative work, and a post machine for sewing the pieces together. It's called a post machine because the bobbin is up in a post, and that gives you a wide range of motion through here. This thread is for decorative stitching, and it is size 33, which is unusual. I was trained to use 33 thread because you can use a smaller needle, and the smaller the needle, the smaller the hole, so you can make finer work. So this is all 33 thread. Most places, a lot of bootmakers use 46. It's much easier to find. I'm the only person that sells size 33 thread in colors. These are boot trees. So after I finish with a pair of boots, they're kind of floppy and squished from me working on them. And then I just wet them and put these in and hang them. And that gives them their nice crisp shape back. They're not really for stretching, basically if you're stretching your boots, you maybe should think about your patterning. These are more just for shaping. Not to say that I've never stretched, but that's not supposed to be the point. But this is where I do all of my sanding and shaping. There, when I'm fitting a last and adding leather buildups to a last to add a bunion or a high instep or whatever, I'll shape it on here. If I need to change the toe, I'll shape it on here. And then once I'm building the boots, the heels, I'm shaping the heels on here. I'm sanding the sole edges down to where they're nice and the nice shape. And then also I can use this one and this fine sanding wheel to make them slick and shiny. So I'm at this machine a lot. This is my bench. This is where I work. I spend a lot of time here. For instance, this is a boot top that I'm working on now. This is the design that I drew. And then here are all the little pieces to help me create this design. Let's see, now that one goes there. And this one goes there like that. And this is the piece that will go behind the green. And anyway, when I'm through, that's what happened with all these little puzzle pieces. And I still have one top band to put on this one. I don't know why I stopped. This is my post machine. And I like this one because it has a smaller post, and which allows me to get into tighter areas. And this right here is my beautiful little Singer 110W 125. It's not a computerized motor. There is nothing computerized on this machine. If I'm doing 10 rows of stitching, that is me stitching 10 rows, one at a time. I am very proud of this little machine right here. There was a bootmaker named Archer LaForce. Archer LaForce was trained by Gus Blucher, and Gus trained Archer, and then Archer was one of the men who trained my mentor, Jay Griffith. Archer had this thing where he would cut the tongue of the vamp, the foot part, and the tongue on the heel counter with this little scalloped, with a little scallop around the edge. He was the only bootmaker that did that. And this is the machine that belonged to Archer LaForce. This is the machine that he cut that with. This lovely machine is called a 5-in-1. And it's called a 5-in-1 because it does 3 things. You can also get a 3-in-1 that does 2 things. But anyway.
Oh, that's okay. I'm sorry I sewed. That went over my head for a second.
No, basically it does it does 5 things, but it kind of depends. I've looked up the manual and it's weird the way they get it to doing 3 things. They're like, it cuts frontwards and it cuts backwards. Or anyway, it does cut, and then it skives. So skiving is thinning something at an angle along the edge. And then splitting is where you just make it thinner all the way across. So supposedly, I believe one of the things is they say it can split, because if you go this way and then you go, come on.
So that's how they do it. I always wondered, I didn't really wonder that, but now that makes sense.
So now it's kind of split because I skived it on both sides. But basically it does 3 things. And then this is called a welt press. So when you're making boots, after you put the sole on, it'll make impressions on the sole, so I'm not going to actually do it. But you can stick this in here and run it all the way around, and it will tightly squeeze these 2 pieces of leather together. So these are pegging awls. When I'm pegging the sole of a pair of cowboy boots, here's a pegging awl with a bent pegging awl. This is a little weird tool. This is a shank puller for shoes. And then my marvelous collection of hammers. This is a really nice vintage French hammer. I've never seen another one like it. I love her.
I like how you display your hammers like that. That gives me an idea for my garage.
Yes. This is a pair of cowboy boot shank pullers. A super nice pair. Lasting pliers. It's embarrassing how messy my bench is right now. Tack puller. So anyway, that's the way my bench is supposed to look. This is a little decorative wheel. It's a nice little design. These are my wood pegs. I have 4 14s, 5.5 12s, 6 11s, and 7 9s. The way pegs are sized is so funny. Okay, and there's a lot of places in American shoemaking where you don't reduce your fractions. It's in eighths of an inch. So you don't say 3/4 of an inch, you say 6/8. And this is one of the places where that is true. So these pegs are 6'11", and what that sizing means is they are, the first number 6, they're 6/8 of an inch long. And then the 11 means they're 1/11 by 1/11 by 1/11 by 1/11 square. Isn't that fun? So these 7 9s are 7/8 of an inch long, 1/9 by 1/9 by 1/9 by 1/9 square. And I will show you how cowboy boot soles are pegged. So this is a pegging awl. This is a pegging haft, and that's the pegging awl, the metal part. And I'm going to use that to make a hole. And then on camera, I will probably not get this right. Get it seated. There we go. Drive it all the way in.
And then could you tell me before, like, what this is for, why you do this?
By the way, these are kind of, obviously I didn't get some of them all the way in, but also I spray them with water to help them swell up. So that's the reason it looks like a little porcupine here. And the purpose of the wood pegs is to strengthen the shank area and make it more stable and less flexible. Because if you're riding a horse and you've got some weight here, you don't want this area to be flexible. So it has a steel shank in here, under here like this. There's a heavy steel shank, but also along these edges, it is pegged with a double row of wooden pegs, and that also helps strengthen this arch area. Anytime you have a construction with a heel, you have to keep the arch strong, otherwise the whole boot or shoe will collapse with the wearer's weight. The benefit of a custom-made boot is not only quality. I mean, the quality is so much better because what a factory offers is speed and efficiency and price. And there's nothing wrong with those things. I'm not running them down at all. But a factory wants to make it quickly and cheaply. So if you want something tomorrow, you want a factory boot. But if you want something that's made from the very best materials and a craftsman, one craftsman all the way through, puts all their labor and time and focus on that boot, and you want to be able to choose your colors and your design to have a boot made just for you, then that's a bespoke boot. And then you have to pay more for it. And I do want to say with my prices, I think a lot of times people look at me and go, oh, she's making boots for $10,000 a pair. She's getting really rich. But you have to think about the fact that when I first started, I was building boots 7 days a week almost. I was building so many boots at very cheap prices. And as the number of boots that I built went down, the price came up, and the money level has stayed the same because I'm making so many fewer boots. I'm making fewer boots now. It's evened out. I make very few boots for a lot of money, or I could make a whole bunch of boots for not as much money, and I chose the first one. My boot prices start at $10,000, which is on the high side, and I did that because I started the supply business, and the supply business keeps me incredibly busy. And I can't take many orders. I don't have all the time to build boots that I used to. And I decided I wanted to find a way to make boots for joy and to make boots that satisfied me as an artist. And price was really the only way I could think of to control demand. I don't know how to control demand otherwise. So I did it with price. And that carved me out a little space to do what I wanted to do. And then I've also used that space to make boots for musicians that I like. I love classic country music. I love bluegrass music. I like supporting musicians. So occasionally I'll find a musician that I really enjoy and I will approach them and say, can I make you a pair of boots for free? And it sounds a little weird, but it's just what I enjoy. And then I have more creative control since these boots are free, I get more input into what color and design we're going to have. And then I also have complete and total control over timeline. They will be done when I get them done. You don't get to complain because they're free. And that has been wonderful for me because I get to have friendships with people whose music I love, and I get to make the boots that I want to make, and I don't have the deadline hanging over me. I don't have the aspect of money and business hanging over me. I get to just do it because I want to. And then occasionally someone will come along and actually order boots as a customer, and it's created a calendar and a schedule for me that works with the supply business. Most of the musicians are really happy when they get their boots and surprised and pleased, and I just want them to wear them on stage. I love singing, but I'm not a good singer, unfortunately. So I'm never going to get to stand on the Opry stage, but I've had boots on the Opry stage, and that makes me really happy. I've made boots for the Malpas brothers, and the Malpas brothers that was really my trial run for making boots, making friends with musicians, was making boots for the Malpas brothers, and that was such a rewarding experience. And I knew it was right when I approached Taylor Malpas, and I said, what do you want? What design do you want on your boot tops? And he said, could you make me a pair of Satan Is Real boots? And Satan Is Real is an iconic gospel album by a band from the 1950s called the Louvin Brothers. And I was raised on the gospel music of the Louvin Brothers. I remember the album Satan Is Real from my childhood. That song means a lot to me because it perfectly describes my childhood. I was raised in a conservative little church. I grew up going to camp meetings. I know every word. I experienced and lived every word of that song, Satan Is Real. And so when Taylor said, can you make me a pair of Satan Is Real boots? That's the moment that I knew I was doing the right thing. We were on the same page, and I had found the thing that would bring me joy. I believe that it's important to save the craft of cowboy boot making because I believe that craft is important. I wasn't raised a cowboy. I'm not sure that we can artificially keep a trade or a lifestyle that there's no demand for anymore, which makes me sad. I'm not joyful about that. The world moves on, and there's nothing we can do about that. But I feel like craft itself, craft as an entity itself, needs to be preserved and honored, because I see so many people that when you sit at a computer all day long, you have nothing tangible to show for it. I'm not saying you're not doing good and you're not working, but you just don't have anything tangible to show. And I feel that as humans, we want to work with our hands. We want to make something and say, look, here's a thing that I made that I can touch and you can touch. And I've always somewhat approached cowboy boot making from that standpoint as just simply craft. And it needs to be preserved for the beauty of craft.